Welcome to The Authority File, the podcast where you'll hear conversations with academic librarians, technologists, researchers, and authors whose work is laying the foundation for higher education's future. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice, and I'm excited to be speaking with Ron Williamson, who, along with Robert Von Bitter, co-edited the book The History and Archaeology of the Iroquois du Nord. The title is part of the University of Ottawa Press Mercury series, which is published in partnership with the Canadian Museum of History. The title offers a close examination of several village sites around the north shore of Lake Ontario established in the mid to late 17th century by the Haudenosaunee or Five Nations Iroquois. The title's contributors bring together Indigenous knowledge and recent archaeological findings that greatly advance the historical context of these sites, which, until now, have had very little written about them. This four-part series of The Authority File is brought to you by Ottawa University Press. In this second episode, we take a deeper dive into the book, learn more about one of the more mysterious sites, and why there's been a lack of published material on the archaeology of these sites. Okay, so how do you explain the lack of published material on the archaeology of these sites?
Yeah, this is a kind of a period of Great Lakes Indigenous and colonial period history, early colonial period history, about which little really has been written. There were a few publications by Percy Robinson, a Toronto historian, and a few academic historians, but they didn't provide much detailed information about these sites. The historical maps that are available of this period, the 17th century, are at a scale that's not really helpful in finding sites. For example, and they were contradictory. Some said a site might be on one side of a river or another. So there was kind of a lack of material published on this, and that's because while there were very few European visitors to these sites, we have only a few accounts of what went on when Europeans visited the site. So, for example, in 1676, a party of traders visited Tayagon. In 1678, Father Louis Hennepin and other visits by the famous explorer La Salle between 1680 and 82. And this is a period when there was a Sulpician mission in Kente, from which these missionaries or explorers came. Well, they were coming from Montreal originally, but from Kente. And so we have accounts of them making these journeys, but we have very little available to us as to what exactly happened during these visits, and almost no details about the detailed layout of the places or their actually detailed locations.
Okay, excellent. So there's a site in Burlington that is still a mystery, correct? What is happening at that site?
Indeed. It can be said its location is an enduring Canadian mystery, actually. There's a chapter in the book written by a scholar from Western University. His name's Niels Ferris. And he argues that this site called Tianawata was occupied by Haudenosaunee, but these Haudenosaunee were neutral individuals who were in the process of becoming Haudenosaunee, having been adopted into the Iroquois or the Haudenosaunee in 1651, having been dispersed from their former location in southern Ontario. And Ferris thinks that rather than a site controlling a regular trading route, that it's probably a traditional hunting location that these folks knew about, and people in the region would know that there were Haudenosaunee living at this site. Now the problem is, while the site was visited by the famous explorer Galinée in 1669, its exact location is unknown. His account, Galinée's account, is of a fairly arduous 2-day journey, including wading through waist-high, presumably swamp water, from Coote's Paradise on Western Bay. So this is at the extreme western end of Lake Ontario. There's a little bay there, and at the very end of the bay, there's this little area known as Coote's Paradise. So they left there, and it took them 2 days to get to the settlement. So a number of candidate sites have been proposed for the location of this Idaean village, and they're mainly based on 19th century collections of early 17th century neutral sites. So because they had glass beads and lots of metal artifacts, people at that time thought, oh, this must be the site Galenay visited. But in fact, once we understood how to seriate, or how to know the difference between glass bead assemblages of the early 17th century and the mid to late 17th century, we realized that all of those sites were in fact early 17th century or early to mid 17th century neutral sites, and that they were not an ID settlement. And so we don't have an assemblage from that period in our hands that dates to the period of the IDN. So we're not yet sure exactly where it is. Neil Ferris tells a story about being at McMaster University, where he was a PhD student in the early 2000s, and seeing a collection brought in by an avocational that in retrospect he realizes was indeed early or glass beads dating to the mid to late 17th century. He has the name of that individual and has been unable to track them down. So in fact, we had a tantalizing handle on that, if only for an
Indeed,
hour
yeah.
one afternoon 25 years ago. So
Oh, wow.
we don't have any current research on that site. We need more survey, and no doubt it's on private land, which could provide a bit of a challenge.
Okay. So you've mentioned the term neutral site a couple of times now, and I'm wondering if you could, explain that for our listeners. What does that mean?
Yeah, neutral is an Iroquois-speaking group. So the Haudenosaunee were 5 nations: the Cayugan, the Seneca, the Mohawk, the Onondaga, and they spoke the Iroquois language, but so too did the Huron-Wendat and the Neutral Nation, which lived at the west end of Lake Ontario and in the
Oh,
Niagara
okay.
Peninsula.
Got it. Okay. Um, so speaking of the 5 nations, you've mentioned that the land acknowledgement for Toronto is exceedingly complex, and that it includes, those nations, one of which obviously is the Haudenosaunee, also known as the Iroquois. Their inclusion in the acknowledgement was never clearly understood, as I take it. Can you tell us how your book clears that up?
Sure. Yeah, land acknowledgements, unless you're in an area that was occupied by one group, can be exceptionally fraught with difficulty, because the average person just does not know the complex history. And that's
Hmm.
certainly the case for Toronto. In Toronto, the land acknowledgement mentions a particular nation called the Mississauga the Credit, who are Anishinaabe peoples, and they actually signed the treaty in 1763 with the British for the lands that Toronto was on. There are other Anishinaabe people mentioned in the Toronto acknowledgement, as well as Chippewa, which is odd because the Chippewa are Anishinaabe, so it's a bit confusing. And then the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat peoples. So the Wendat peoples, it is known, had farming villages in Toronto and north of Toronto, basically from about 1300 to 1650. And the Haudenosaunee, no one was perfectly sure why the Haudenosaunee was included, although they certainly should have been, because they had these villages along the north shore of Lake Ontario, and certainly had use of all of southern Ontario between, let's say, 1660s and 1680s, late 1680s. So our book tells a chapter of Haudenosaunee history that explains why they're actually in the Toronto Land Acknowledgement.
You just heard from Ron Williamson. Ron is founder and senior associate of Archaeological Services, Inc., a private archaeological and cultural heritage consulting firm based in Ontario. He has also published extensively on Indigenous and early colonial Great Lakes history. This episode is brought to you with support from Ottawa University Press. Join us next week when we learn more about the historical context of the North Shore sites, European influences, and what the Haudenosaunee were like. As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising manager Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.